Eleanor balanced the warm peach cobbler in her hands, the sugary aroma still rising from the dish she had prepared with care that morning. She paused just outside the wooden gate of her son David's backyard, adjusting her scarf against the late afternoon breeze. Voices floated over the fence, laughter mixed with clinking glasses and the faint rhythm of music. Then she heard it, sharp, unmistakable. "Why is she even still alive?" Sarah's voice, followed by a quick, cruel laugh. The words sliced through Eleanor's chest like glass. Her knees wavered, and for a moment she considered turning back, leaving the cobbler on the porch as if she had never come. But pride, or perhaps a deep yearning not to be erased, pushed her forward. She steadied her breath and lifted the latch. The backyard was strung with lights, the picnic tables crowded with plates of food and glasses of wine. No one turned toward her. No one called her name. Eleanor stepped in quietly, forcing a smile that no one noticed. "Oh, Eleanor," Sarah said after a long pause, her lips tight and eyes flickering with annoyance. "We didn't know you were coming." Eleanor held out the cobbler, her hands steady despite the storm inside her chest. "I brought dessert," she said softly. But no one reached to take the dish. She carried it herself to the far end of the table, choosing a folding chair that wobbled beneath her weight. From her corner, she watched the celebration unfold. Laughter rippled through the crowd, but it never reached her. The grandchildren dashed past, their small feet pounding against the grass. None stopped to say hello. None remembered the gummy worms she used to sneak into their pockets or the bedtime stories she had told when their parents were busy. David raised his beer for a toast. "To family," he cheered. Glasses clinked all around, faces shining with warmth and belonging, but not a single glance landed on Eleanor. Her heart ached, but her back stayed straight. She would not crumble here, not in front of those who treated her presence like an inconvenience. She sat in silence, her hands folded neatly on her lap, the untouched cobbler cooling by her side. And in that heavy quiet, Eleanor realized a truth she had long resisted. She was no longer welcome in the family she had sacrificed so much to build. The night air was cool as Eleanor walked home, the sound of laughter from David's house fading behind her with each step. Her hands felt strangely light now that the cobbler was gone, left untouched at the end of the table. She had carried it there with love, and it had been met with indifference. That thought weighed heavier than the dish ever had. Inside her quiet home, Eleanor hung her coat on the rack and slipped off her shoes with a sigh. The silence pressed in, but it was gentler than the cruel noise she had just left. She filled the kettle and waited for it to whistle, her mind drifting to years of sacrifices. School lunches she packed, nights she stayed up sewing costumes, the steady work she had done to keep the family afloat after her husband passed. All of it felt like a distant story now, one her son and his wife had long forgotten. Unable to sleep, Eleanor went to the study and pulled open the bottom drawer of an old oak cabinet. Folders, receipts, and neatly bundled papers spilled out, each one a memory frozen in ink. She flipped through until her fingers stopped on a thin folder marked David, House. The numbers were clear: $40,000 transferred from her retirement fund. At the time, she had called it a gift, insisting he build a strong future for his family. She had told herself she didn't need it, that her son's success was her success. Now, staring at the faded paperwork, the reality struck harder than Sarah's cruel words. That money had been her safety net, her hard-earned security. And David had taken it without a second thought, without gratitude, without care. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, clutching the folder to her chest. Her eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall. Instead, a steady calm spread through her. For the first time in years, she saw her own reflection clearly, not as the ever-giving mother, not as the silent guest in her own family, but as a woman who still had choices. She whispered aloud to the empty room, "No more." That night, Eleanor made a vow. She would no longer live as the useful mother, convenient when needed, discarded when not. She would take back control of her life, piece by piece. Her future, whatever time she had left, would no longer belong to David or Sarah. It would belong to her. The morning after her sleepless night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, the folder of old papers still beside her. She traced her finger over the faded ink, the evidence of her sacrifice, and felt the determination settle deeper in her bones. For years, she had told herself that keeping peace in the family was worth any cost. But peace had turned into silence, and silence into erasure. She needed guidance, someone who could confirm what her heart already knew, that she still had the right to shape her future. That afternoon, she dialed Lena's number. Lena was not a close friend, more of an acquaintance she had met through church gatherings, but Eleanor remembered she was sharp, confident, and worked in a law office. "Eleanor," Lena's warm voice came through the line. "It's been a while. How are you?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "How am I?" she thought. Invisible. Betrayed. Tired. Instead, she said softly, "I need advice. Legal advice, if you have the time." They met later that week at a small cafe tucked on the corner of Main Street. The chatter of young families and students buzzed around them, but Eleanor's world narrowed to Lena's steady eyes and the legal pad she carried. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Eleanor poured out the story: the money for David's house, the cruel words from Sarah, the years of being taken for granted. Lena listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes. When Eleanor finally fell silent, her voice thick with emotion, Lena spoke firmly. "The house is David's. You gave him that money freely and legally it's his. You can't change that now." The truth landed heavily, though Eleanor had expected it. She nodded slowly, but Lena continued, her tone softening. "That doesn't mean you've lost everything. Your retirement accounts, your savings, your insurance policies, those are yours. And your will is yours to change whenever you choose. You still have power, Eleanor. More than you realize." For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at her. Power. The word felt foreign, almost dangerous, yet comforting. She had lived so long believing her life revolved around what others needed. To hear that she still had the ability to draw boundaries, to redirect her legacy, was like opening a window in a room she thought was sealed shut. She left the cafe with her shoulders straighter, her steps firmer. That evening, Eleanor spread her papers across the dining table: the bank statements, the insurance documents, the faded will that named David as executor. She began marking them with sticky notes, organizing, reclaiming, rewriting her future line by line. It was only the beginning, but for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something close to hope. The following weeks became a whirlwind of signatures, appointments, and quiet resolve. Eleanor moved with a determination that surprised even herself. Each document she signed felt like a stitch in a torn fabric, slowly mending the pieces of her life that had unraveled over the years. Her first step was the most difficult: revoking David's power of attorney. For too long, she had trusted him with decisions about her finances, believing it was practical and responsible. Sitting in the notary's office, pen in hand, she hesitated only briefly. "This is my life," she reminded herself. The pen pressed to paper, and with one sweeping line, David's legal hold over her future was gone. Next came the bank accounts. Eleanor walked into the branch she had visited for decades, a place where the tellers greeted her by name. This time, she asked for privacy. Behind closed doors, she quietly removed David's name from every account, every line of access he had once held. She expected guilt to rise in her chest, but instead she felt light, like taking off a heavy coat after carrying it for too long. Her insurance policies followed, the changes almost mechanical now. Each removal was another thread cut, another step toward freedom. Finally, she turned to her will. The old copy had David and Sarah listed as primary heirs, an arrangement she had once believed was natural and just. But as Eleanor sat with the lawyer, she spoke firmly, her voice unwavering. "Remove them both. They will inherit nothing from me." The lawyer glanced up, surprised at her clarity, then nodded and wrote. Eleanor continued, "I want my estate to go to a women's charity, specifically to programs that support survivors of domestic violence." When the final page was signed, Eleanor exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath the entire time. It wasn't anger that fueled her decision. It was clarity. Her legacy would not be squandered on those who dismissed her worth. It would go to women who needed a hand to stand again, women whose struggles she understood more than anyone had ever asked. That evening, Eleanor stood in her living room, gazing at the photographs on the mantel. Family portraits, school graduations, birthdays, frozen moments of a life she had devoted to others. The house felt too large now, its walls echoing with memories that were more painful than comforting. She decided it was time. The house would be sold, and she would move into a smaller apartment. Not a retreat, but a fresh beginning. A space that was hers alone, quiet, manageable, filled only with the things and people she chose. Eleanor closed the last folder of documents and set it aside. For the first time in decades, she felt the unfamiliar thrill of independence. The ties that had bound her were gone, and in their place was a new horizon, waiting. The knock at the door was sharp, almost violent. Eleanor had just finished watering the small pot of marigolds she kept on her porch, bright orange blooms that seemed to defy bitterness by shining even in the autumn chill. She set the watering can aside, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened the door. David stood there, his jaw tight, eyes blazing. "What the hell is going on, Mom?" he demanded before even stepping inside. Without waiting for her reply, he pushed past her into the living room, his footsteps heavy with anger. Eleanor closed the door quietly, taking her time, unwilling to match his storm. "You'll have to tell me what you mean," she said, her voice steady. David spun to face her, his face red. "Don't play games with me. The bank called. The lawyer, too. I'm off the accounts, off the insurance, and the will." His voice cracked with disbelief. "You cut me out of the will? After everything I've done for you?" Eleanor's hands trembled slightly, but she clasped them together. "After everything I've done for you, David. $40,000 for your house. Years of support, sacrifices you never even noticed. And what did I hear in return?" She paused, her gaze sharp. "Your wife laughing, asking why I was still alive." David flinched, his bravado faltering for a moment. "She didn't mean it like that. Sarah, she meant exactly what she said." Eleanor's voice was calm but unyielding. "And you let her. You let her disrespect me, dismiss me, and you said nothing." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, David muttered, "This is insane. You're tearing the family apart." Eleanor shook her head. "No, David. The family was torn apart the moment respect was lost. I will not pretend otherwise any longer." As he stood there, fuming, a movement near the hallway caught his eye. A small sketchbook lay on the side table, half hidden under a folded scarf. David picked it up, flipping it open to find delicate pencil drawings, flowers, trees, and one unmistakable picture of Eleanor smiling beside a teenage girl. "Ruby's been here," he said flatly. Eleanor met his glare with quiet defiance. "Yes. She comes when she wants to. She talks to me. She listens." David's face darkened. "So my daughter's sneaking around behind my back to visit you?" "Not sneaking," Eleanor corrected gently. "Choosing. She's old enough to decide where she feels safe, where she feels heard." David slammed the sketchbook shut, his voice rising. "You're poisoning her against us." Eleanor stood tall, her eyes unwavering. "No, David. I'm giving her what you and Sarah never gave me: kindness, time, and a place where she matters." For a long moment, they stared at each other, mother and son, a chasm of years and unspoken words between them. Then, with a frustrated growl, David dropped the sketchbook back on the table and stormed toward the door. Eleanor followed at her own pace, pausing by the marigolds on the porch. Their bright blooms glowed in the fading sunlight. She whispered, more to herself than to him, "Marigolds grow stronger in poor soil, David. Sometimes neglect makes them bloom brighter." He didn't answer. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Eleanor alone in her quiet home, the marigolds standing tall beside her. A few days after David's angry visit, Eleanor heard the soft knock she had come to recognize. It was not the harsh pounding of confrontation, but a gentle rhythm. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Eleanor smiled before she even opened the door. Ruby stood there, her backpack slung over one shoulder, wisps of hair falling into her eyes. "Hi, Grandma," she said shyly. Eleanor opened the door wide. "Come in, sweetheart. I was just making tea." They settled at the small kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. Ruby pulled out her sketchbook, flipping to a fresh page. She always drew when she visited, the scratch of her pencil filling the quiet spaces. Today, however, her hands lingered, hesitant. Finally, she looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, Grandma. For ignoring you at the party. For acting like you didn't matter. I didn't know how to stand up to them." Eleanor reached across the table, gently taking Ruby's trembling hand. "Oh, my dear girl. You don't need to apologize for being young. I know how hard it is to speak when the people around you don't want to listen." Ruby's shoulders shook as she whispered, "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong anywhere. At home, Mom and Dad are always busy or fighting. At school, I don't fit in. But when I come here," she trailed off, her voice breaking. "When I come here, I feel like I can breathe." Eleanor's heart ached, not just from sorrow but from a fierce tenderness. "Then this will always be your place, Ruby. A place where you are wanted, where you are loved. No questions, no conditions." Ruby wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and gave a small, relieved laugh. "You always know what to say." They spent the afternoon together, Eleanor sharing stories of her childhood, of marigolds blooming in her mother's garden, of the little joys that had carried her through difficult times. Ruby listened intently, sketching as Eleanor spoke, capturing the flowers, the old family home, and even a small teacup that Eleanor still used every morning. When the sun dipped low, Ruby packed her things but lingered at the door. "Grandma," she said softly, "you make me want to be braver. To not just disappear in the background." Eleanor kissed her forehead, her voice warm with pride. "And you already are, Ruby. You came here. You spoke your truth. That's courage." As Ruby walked down the path, Eleanor stood among her blooming marigolds, her chest full of a comfort she hadn't known in years. The cruelty of the past weeks still stung, but Ruby's honesty had soothed the wound. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt not just strong, but deeply, profoundly loved. The movers had just carried the last box into Eleanor's new apartment when she stood at the threshold, taking it all in. The space was smaller, simpler, but sunlight streamed generously through the windows, catching the soft curtains she had chosen herself. No echoes of old arguments lingered here, no shadows of unspoken resentments. This was her place, chosen with her own hands. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, David's. Eleanor sat in her armchair for a long while before opening it, the marigolds Ruby had drawn for her resting in a frame on the table beside her. The letter was brief but heavy with words she had longed to hear in other times. "I'm sorry, Mom. I see now how wrong I've been. I let Sarah's words and my pride get in the way. I want to make things right. Please, can we start over?" Eleanor read it once, then again, tracing the lines with her finger. Her eyes stung, but not from anger. Instead, a deep calm filled her. She folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope, setting it in a drawer. She would not reply that it wasn't out of cruelty. It was clarity. Forgiveness, she realized, was not a gift she owed to David. It was a gift she gave herself. By letting go of the bitterness, she freed her heart from chains she had carried too long. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor found joy in small, unexpected places. Ruby often came by with her sketchbook, showing her new drawings, wildflowers tangled together, stormy skies, and portraits that seemed to carry more feeling than words ever could. "You're finding your voice," Eleanor told her one afternoon, studying a drawing of a girl holding a lantern in the dark. Ruby smiled shyly. "Maybe because you finally made me feel like I had won." The words touched Eleanor more deeply than Ruby could know. It was then that Eleanor decided her legacy needed to stretch further than bloodlines or old expectations. She arranged for a substantial donation to a women's shelter, a place that offered safety and hope to those who had been silenced or hurt. When she signed the papers, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Her life's work would not vanish into the void of ungrateful hands. It would bloom in the lives of women who needed light in their darkest hours. As she walked home that evening, the late sun casting a golden glow across the city, Eleanor carried no regrets. Her story was not ending, it was simply being rewritten, one act of compassion at a time. The morning of Eleanor's 73rd birthday dawned quietly, the pale light of spring spilling across her apartment. She set out her favorite porcelain teacup, a small ritual she had come to love in her new home. The apartment was modest, but every corner reflected her. Books stacked neatly on the shelf, marigolds blooming by the window, and framed sketches Ruby had given her brightening the walls. A gentle knock came at the door. Eleanor opened it to find Ruby, cheeks pink from the walk, holding a bouquet of yellow tulips that glowed like sunlight. "Happy birthday, Grandma," Ruby exclaimed, throwing her arms around her. Eleanor held her close, breathing in the warmth of the moment. "You remembered my favorite," she said, touching the tulips with care. Ruby smiled and handed her a folded card, edges uneven, clearly cut by hand. On the front was a drawing: 2 wooden chairs on a porch, one empty, one with a steaming teacup. Inside, in Ruby's neat but slightly uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for keeping a seat for me." Eleanor pressed the card to her chest, her eyes glistening. "Oh, Ruby," she whispered, "this means more than you'll ever know." They spent the day together, baking a small cake, sharing stories, and laughing until their cheeks ached. Later, a few neighbors and new friends from her community center stopped by with flowers and well wishes. These were people who saw her not as an obligation, but as a friend, a woman with stories worth hearing. As evening fell, Eleanor sat by the window with Ruby beside her. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but her heart was full not from what she saw outside, but from what surrounded her within. Kindness, respect, and love freely given. She thought of David's letter, still tucked away in her drawer, and felt no sting, no ache. Forgiveness had already been granted, not for reconciliation, but for release. She no longer lived in waiting for calls that never came, or in anger for words that could not be unsaid. Instead, she lived in peace. Her legacy was no longer defined by sacrifice unnoticed or love unreturned. It was written now in the tulips Ruby carried, in the card with its 2 chairs, in the donation that would shelter women she would never meet, but whose lives would be touched by her choice. Eleanor leaned back, her hand resting on Ruby's, and let a deep calm settle over her. She was free, free from bitterness, free from fear, free to live the days ahead with dignity, laughter, and self-love, and in that freedom, she discovered the truest kind of home.